Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Dark is the Wood by Kristin Ward, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. The crops died first. It was subtle in the beginning. A bad season or two was normal, nothing to worry about, though it was a hardship for the inhabitants of Rudgard. But when 2 seasons turned into 3 and 4, people started to talk. They sought out the religious, begging priests to bless the land and offering sacrifices of lamb and calf. Rudgard's people turned to the gods. Ceremonies were held. By day, men tore cloths from their backs as they flailed and beseeched under the fiery heat of the sun god. Skin reddened, burned, and blistered under Irel's mighty glare. By night, women linked hands and danced beneath the pale moon, offering tears, blood, and song to Ceridwen, the goddess of nature and rebirth. Hope stirred. The land rebounded, presenting a bountiful yield, but it did not last. Frustrated and angry, the people cursed Ceridwen, believing the goddess had forsaken them. Some turned their ire to Irel, but most feared angering the fire god and remained steadfast in worship, though in their hearts doubt sowed. The wasting sank into the earth, slowly leaching the soil where crops grew. It spread like the vines of a creeper crawling across the land. It had consumed the border towns first, then all of the kingdom of Mirren. And then, like the land, children began to wither. On the heels of the driest spring in a century, Rudgard's children started to sicken. By the fall, nearly a quarter crossed the river. By the following spring, more showed the first ominous signs of an illness no medicine or prayer could cure. Fear set in, and accusation. Everyone knew the Shadowlands bordering the town were cursed. Dark creatures roamed the great dragon's realm, and only a fool would enter there. But they were desperate. Without Ceridwen, they were lost. Irel and the dragon, both creatures of fire, became undisputed godlike symbols. Many believed the great dragon was the father of man and that the serpent would hear the pleas and save his children. Offerings were made. First, they were animals and food, each gone shortly after being placed at the edge of the dark forest. But the plague continued, reaping crops and children. They offered more food, more animals, and more prayer. When the young daughter of Sir Hubert Weston, the local lord, sickened, the wealthy knight offered a king's ransom in jewels he'd collected during his time across the Black Strait. Kneeling at the border of Dwyer Wood, he renounced the old gods and begged the great dragon to spare his daughter, placing the sack of precious stones at the base of a gnarled tree. It was gone the next day. His daughter, Marigold, took her last breath a sennight later. Ceridwen was dead to them. Irel and the dragon did not hear their pleas. So they turned to another deity, Setanta, the god of war. Setantan priests convinced the people a human sacrifice was required to appease the one true god and capture the attention of the dragon. Serfs were the first to be chained to posts just outside the border, but they were always whole come morning. Unbound and returned to their masters, they told stories of strange noises coming from the depths of the accursed woods. The priests decided someone must enter the Shadowlands and give their flesh and blood to the beasts that roamed there. Those people prodded at the point of a sword and forced to cross into the forest, disappeared into the trees, their departure followed quickly by blood-curdling screams. But the wasting did not abate. The villagers stopped trying to enter Dwyer Wood, and Sir Weston made it a law not to cross into the Shadowlands. Time continued its relentless march. Crops struggled, children died, and no one crossed into Dragon's domain. Decades passed, and the people learned to accept their fate. For every child who crossed the river, 3 would live and grow to adulthood. For every blight-ridden field, others would yield enough to keep communities from falling into ruin. It was a world without gods, a world without hope, a world of death and disease and war. Across the kingdom, the once proud temples of Ceridwen were razed. What point was there in honoring the goddess of nature and rebirth when she did not listen as they suckled a dying child at their breast? But even the bravest men lacked the courage to defy Uriel as he hovered, callous and cruel in the heavens. Like the dragon, he was a god of fire and might, so they bowed to him even while he made them suffer. Only Setanta seemed pleased. Only Setanta gifted his followers with plunder and slaves as men marched to war to fight and die for what was left of their world. Through it all, the Shadowlands remained, dark and unchanged. Nothing entered and nothing left that place. It became a thing people whispered of beneath the glow of a candle. Stories of dragon-born, and witches grew into legends. But legends are substantial things made of words. In time, many believed that, like Cyrodiil, the great dragon was dead. He hadn't flown through the skies for so long that he must have crossed the river like so many others. But he was not dead. He was trapped, biding his time until an opportunity arose. And his wait was nearly over. Chapter 1. Gillian Drake stood at her brother's bedside holding a bowl of broth in her hands. Worry creased her youthful face as she watched Rory's chest rise and fall beneath the child's thin blanket. As before, she'd added tulsi leaves and ginger to the liquid, taking a pinch of salt from their dwindling supplies to enhance the properties of the plants. Rory's lashes fluttered when she rubbed his chest. Cracking his blue eyes open, a smile wavered on his lips. "Gillian," he whispered, pushing his body against his pillow. He'd been waking later and later over the last few weeks. Her parents hadn't said the words, but she knew it was the wasting. They all did. Ruffling red hair poking out in every direction on his head, Gillian said, "You're sleeping the day away, lazybones. Scoot." She waited for him to shift his body closer to the wattle and daub wall of their small home and sat on the edge of his raised pallet. "I want you to eat and then come outside and help me in the garden." He cupped his hands around the bowl and sniffed with a grimace. "It smells bad." "Then plug your nose." Rory sighed as only an 8-year-old could, with all the youthful exasperation of a disgruntled sibling. There was a subtle tremor in his hand as he took the spoon. Gillian watched the utensil wobble, grief threatening to etch its way into the corners of her mouth. Nobody survived the wasting. Nobody. Masking her emotions, she made small talk as he ate, tipping the bowl toward her when Rory claimed it was empty. "There are at least 2 spoonfuls left." She pushed it back to him and folded her arms. "I'm full." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, that's too bad. I made a honey cake." Gillian stood and tugged on the bodice of her drab gown. It was too tight in the chest and arms. In fact, it had been too small last spring, but her parents needed to pinch every penny just to get by. The price of the food they couldn't grow had increased since the blight, and most of the vendors had stopped showing up on market day 3 years ago when it was clear the townfolk could afford little more than necessities. The last thing that she needed was to eat cake and strain the seams of her worn clothes. But life had few joys these days, and she was loath to give up on any of them. Making her brother's favorite treat was worth the cost of the flour or another small tear. "More for me, then." She reached for the bowl. Rory snatched it away and tipped it to his mouth, making slurping noises. A thin trail of broth ran down his chin, and he wiped it away with a small belch, grinning when he thrust the empty bowl into her hands. His cheeks were flushed, the broth having done its work, but she knew by now the healthy blush would fade, leaving behind a gray pallor. "May I have cake now?" She looked at the dregs in the bottom of the bowl and then toward his stomach. "Are you sure those last few drops don't fill you up? I don't mind eating your slice. Wouldn't want it to go waste." "I burped some space," he announced, and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. Her face was pained as she looked at them. They were spindly things. He was withering away before her eyes, and she couldn't stop it. No one could. Rory had been a gift to her parents after years of miscarriages and stillbirths. Both Nave and her husband Lachlan doted over the boy. And at 10 years older, Gillian was no different, taking special pride in every stage of his growth. But the wasting cared nothing for status or familial bonds. There wasn't a family in Redguard that its relentless progression hadn't touched. Rory shuffled to the peg where a shirt and trousers hung, tugging at his chest chemise. Gillian left the room to let him dress, worry furrowing her brow. Setting the bowl in the wash basin in the cramped kitchen, she looked out the window at the garden where she'd planted rows of herbs, each with medicinal qualities. When her brother showed her the first sign of illness, she'd read every book on the medicines the local bookseller let her borrow. She ventured into every meadow and copse of the trees, searching for plants said to cure everything from gout to a chest cold. But the herbs weren't working. Each day he grew weaker. Soon the first black spot would appear on his chest. After that, he'd have a few months at best. Gillian gripped the side of the basin, fingers digging into the wood hard enough to snap the tip of a fingernail. She winced and popped the digit into her mouth, tugging the ragged edge across. With her teeth, tugging the ragged edge with her teeth free and spitting it onto the floor. The sound of voices had her leaning toward the windowsill where she caught a glimpse of her parents coming in from the small field a stone's throw from their house. They shared the land with 3 other families, each scraping by on the small slip of earth. Her stepfather, Lachlan, had one arm around his wife. The other held a bucket of water. It sloshed over the rim with every step. Just Gillian hustled to the door and swung it open, standing aside as they entered. Nave brushed strands of graying hair from her face and greeted her daughter before craning her neck toward her children's bedroom. Is he awake? Aye, I made him a bone broth with herbs. She cupped Gillian's face, her eyes wrinkling at the corners as she smiled. He's lucky to have you. Your herbs never fail to improve his strength. Gillian frowned and turned away, busying herself by pouring water into the wash basin and cleaning the dishes from the morning meal. Her mother gasped every speck of hope. It hurt to know that any improvement was fleeting and that every morning he was a little frailer than the last. She didn't say such things to her parents. Let them live in a fantasy for a bit longer, she thought, scrubbing a mug with a soaked rag. The sounds of family mixed with the soft splash of water, lulling each of them into a peace that couldn't last as outside Urel turned the sky yellow above the horizon. I saw it on his back, Nave cried, her words carrying through the darkness. Gillian rolled out of bed and pressed her ear to the wall separating their rooms. In the dimness, she picked out her brother, who shared the room, but he was sound asleep. Rory lay sprawled on his stomach, one arm flung out and hanging above the floor. Putting her palms against the wall, she listened to her stepfather argue. It's just a bruise. You know he fell in the garden only days ago. Lachlan paced, his feet pounding dully. It's not a bruise, her mother countered, a voice catching on a strangled sob. The meaning of those words penetrated the walls and landed with a thud in Gillian's heart. I saw it clear as day just below his shoulder. It's just like your nephew, Edwin. With horror-stricken eyes, Gillian drew away from the wall and turned toward her brother. Kneeling at the side of his bed, she gently pulled down his chemise, biting her lip when she saw the unmissable black stain marring his flesh. Sitting back on her heels, she dropped her head and listened to her mother beg. I have to go, Lachlan. Rustling followed the statement along with the murmur of her stepfather's low voice. I can't stay here and watch him die. Gillian slipped out of the room and hovered at the cloth strung across her parents' bedroom doorway. Go? She couldn't believe her mother would talk of leaving, not now when Rory needed her more than ever. She peeked through a gap in the fabric and watched her mother pull a necklace from her strongbox. Put that away. Lachlan strode toward Nave and tried to grab it. She tucked it behind her back and jutted her chin, defying him with her tears. Don't even think it, he whispered harshly. I have to try. She looped the necklace with a strange medallion over her head. They have the power to save him, I know it. You know nothing, he said, voice rising. Nave shushed him, feet moving closer to Gillian. You'll wake them, her mother admonished. Gillian ducked silently into the shadows, straining to listen as their talk grew quiet. Frustrated, she crept closer when Nave moved away from the curtain. The Coven of the Silver Moon has old magic, Nave said, stuffing clothes into a satchel. They'll know what to do more than the zealot you want to invite to our son's bedside. Lachlan grumbled, his boots scuffing the floor. It's just stories, Nave, like all the other stories of creatures lurking in the dragon's wood. It's not real. And if you're wrong and they could save him. He put his hands on his hips. All right, let's pretend they exist. What makes you think they'll speak to you, much less share their power to aid a human child? You know why, Nave said softly. I know no such thing. If they live, they're evil, born of that serpent who'd burn us to ash if we set foot on his land. Finn didn't believe that. Her birth father's name had Gillian peeking through the curtain. Lachlan flinched. Rory is my son, not his. Nave took her husband's hand. You're right. Rory is your son. And Gillian, your daughter, though not by my birth. She tilted her head, eyes pleading with him. You need to trust me. Please, Lachlan. Isn't it worth the risk if they could save our son? Sighing, Lachlan pulled his wife into his arms and hugged her to his chest. You don't fight fair, lady. He kissed her brow. If the medallion works, if the wearer can cross into that accursed place and find the coven, then I should go. Rory needs his mother. Let me do this if it must be done. Maeve shook her head. You know they won't speak to a man. Aye, I know it, but... His head dropped to his chest. He sighed, his words trailing to nothing. Biting her lip, Gillian went over their argument in her head. Her mother spoke of witches, of the coven of the Silver Moon, as if she knew they existed. She'd heard the tales, but assumed they were nothing more than fanciful stories. That her father Finn had known of them, it made no sense. In 18 years, they'd never spoken of such things. No one crossed into the Shadowlands. Dwyer Wood was a forbidden place, forbidden by law, as if they needed such a thing to keep them from entering a realm where the beasts of nightmares lived and breathed. She glanced toward the room where Rory slept. He couldn't lose his mother. Not now. Not when he may only have a few months left. No decision must be made tonight, her stepfather told Maeve. Gillian peered through the curtain, watched Lachlan take the stuffed satchel and set it on the floor next to the doorway. Sleep on it, Maeve. In the morning, we'll decide what's to be done, and if that decision includes you crossing into that realm, I won't stop you. Her mother nodded and lifted the medallion into her palm. She studied the stone disc, turning it to catch the candlelight. Finn would understand, wouldn't he? I don't know. It was meant for Gillian. Maeve slipped the necklace off and draped it over the satchel. It can wait until morning. They doused the lantern. The creak of ropes suspending their mattresses told Gillian they were settling in. She stared at the medallion resting on the satchel through the split in the curtain. Whatever it was, Maeve believed it would grant passage into the Shadowlands and allow an audience with witches. And for some reason, it was meant for her. Should Maeve go, the quest was doomed. She'd never return. Gillian wouldn't let that happen. Creeping back into her bedroom, she kissed Rory's forehead, whispering how much she loved him in his ear. She left a piece of herself in that room when she shut the door, an armful of clothes in her hands. Taking the bag and medallion, she pulled out her mother's things, replaced them with her own, and left the discarded pile on its kitchen table along with a note. Dawn had yet to break when she strung the medallion over her head, slipped into her red cloak, and fled into the night.